Someone requested that I do this episode on Pinex, so let's get going on this one, on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. Our story starts with a guy named William Knoll. He was born in 1875 in Indiana. His dad, Benedict Knoll, was also born in Indiana, and Benedict was a druggist as well. When William graduated from the University of Michigan, he worked with his dad at the drugstore, apparently with his two brothers here. In this 1900 census, they all show as drug salesmen. So William worked there for a few years, and one story says that he came up with the Pinex cough syrup about 1905. Now another source says that Benedict actually formulated the cough syrup and he gave it to his boys when they were little. Then, when the boys got old enough, he would have them help him market it. In 1904, William married Laura, and they ended up having 4 kids. This 1904 article regarding their wedding mentions that William is a manager of his father's drugstore. Here's a passport photo of him and Laura in 1920. So the story goes that in 1905 is when Pinex began to go on the market. 1905 directory shows William along with his brothers still as a clerk at their dad's store. 1906 he shows as a manager at his dad's store. 1906 is also when I see the first ad for Pinex. Continuing on to 1907 and 1908, William is still a manager. It's not until 1909 that Pinex Company is finally listed in the directory with William Knoll as manager, but it also still shows that William is a manager at his dad's store. 1910 census shows William and his wife and a new baby boy, William Jr., of course. This says that he's a manufacturer of medicine. This 1910 article says that William just bought a property on West Columbia Street. It says it has frontage of 20 feet and 150 feet deep, and it's a 3-story brick building. It says Mr. Knoll expects to occupy it in the manufacture of Pinex, the cough remedy which he is making famous. So here's that building. I'm not sure which section of the building the Pinex occupied. Apparently there's supposed to be a P and an X left over that you can see on the front of the building, but I can't find it. In the 1910 directory, it only lists William as manager of Pinex now. His brothers, Albert and George, are still working with Dad. In 1914, they opened a branch in Toronto, Canada. Shortly after this point, Pinex became very popular, to the point that within a few years it was being sold at almost every drugstore in America. So before he turned 40, him and his wife were able to build themselves a beautiful mansion, which at the time cost about $1 million to build. These photos are from a Facebook post from Allen County Genealogical Society of Indiana. The banister to the staircase was covered in red velvet. Everything looks so elegant. I would be afraid to break something. It's beautiful though. By the 1960s, it had been abandoned for a few decades, and what had once been a gathering place for lavish parties and ornate gardens were now covered in weeds, and it was a mess. The house and the land was purchased in 1974. Since it was in such bad shape, the owner decided to have the house razed. The townspeople were not too happy about that. Well, another mansion was built in its place, and it was called the Knoll Mansion, but it's much more modern. I'll put a link to the video that I found, and it was giving a virtual tour of the Knoll Mansion back in 2016. Now, the Knolls had also built another mansion in Miami as a winter home, but I cannot find pictures of that one. So here we are in 1920. William is 44, and none of his kids are yet teenagers. In 1921, he's back in the paper because he thinks that some $200 worth of silverware is missing from his home after he came back from a trip. But he's not sure if he was robbed or not. In 1928, William's dad, Benedict, died, and I don't see any evidence that William's brothers are running their dad's shop after he died. Albert says drugs, but it doesn't specify, and George says a laborer at maybe a lumber yard. In 1930, William's Aunt Sarah is living with them, along with a cook named Eva. By 1932, William Jr. is now 24, and he's working at Pinex as an assistant manager. I didn't really see much in the papers or much of anything changing in the directories until about the time William died in 1941 at the age of 66. They were down in Florida at a horse race when he died seemingly of a heart attack while they were at the track. He was brought back to Indiana to be buried, and his wife died 11 years later and she was buried with her husband. In 1945, we see William's sons, William Jr. and John H., running Pinex. But in 1945, William Jr. died at the age of 36, apparently of some heart trouble as well. So John continues on. Here's 1950, and here's 1960. John's still running it. Notice the address is still the same, so they're still in that same building that they bought back in 1910. Well, in 1960, John decided to get out, and he sold the business to Revlon. It says that Revlon purchased the Pinex company of Fort Wayne and the Toronto location for an undisclosed price. It says Pinex will continue to operate under the current vice president, Bernard Kearns. Unfortunately, 1960 is when the city directories end on Ancestry.com. So I searched for Bernard in the papers, but nothing turned up. I see he lived into his 90s, but I didn't find an obituary for him. The last ad that I see for Pinex is 1973 from Canada. So there are some people alive today who remember taking this medicine. And I did find a site where people commented on this stuff. Some really liked the taste of Pinex while others really hated it. So let's go back to the 1906 article to read what all was in it. Now, you're supposed to take the syrup and mix it with sugar syrup. It says Pinex is extract of tar of the Norwegian white pine, which apparently is rich in guaiacol, which at the time is the best thing to cure stubborn colds, asthma, or even consumption. Earlier versions of this medicine also included chloroform, which would probably be banned by this time in 1906. So these bottles would date from around the 1905 range all the way up to the 1970s. So you should easily be able to find cork tops or screw tops for this. I also stumbled across some photos for Pinex laxatives, and apparently these happened during the 1910s decade. So unfortunately, I couldn't find any cheesy commercials for this one, so it looks like that's probably about it for this story. I have a few more requests in line, so I'll be chipping away at those in the coming weeks. I hope everyone has a great day, and thanks for watching.